Let me say it is an honor and a pleasure to be here with all of you tonight. I'm sorry I can't be there myself, but a few temporary health glitches have slowed me up. But this doesn't diminish my enthusiasm for this entire summit. It's wonderful. There are two broad areas I've been asked to address tonight. First, spirituality in general and some of the truly amazing, even stunning breakthroughs that have recently been made in its regard. And then second, how this overall topic fits with recent updates in evolutionary theory, such as those presented by Dr. David Sloan, who is gracing this summit with his presence. So let's get started. Broadly speaking, there are two fundamental types of spiritual or religious engagements widely present in the world today. And for the moment, I'm using spiritual and religious as generally synonymous. We'll separate them in a minute. The first type of spirituality is a kind of narrative, often mythic in nature, that purports to explain the origin and meaning of the world, usually at the hand of some creator, god, or goddess figure. On an individual level, its purpose is usually to provide some sort of meaning, value, or purpose in life. And on a collective level, its purpose is generally to provide social and cultural cohesion. Usually part of this narrative is a notion of salvation or redemption, the idea that humanity is caught in some sort of original sin or primary misdoing or fundamental ignorance and has to confess, repent, awaken, enlighten, or reorder its life towards a love and service of this groundless ground and its righteous order. And sometime, through the vehicle of this God's one and only primary prophet, or messenger, or even son, who is usually the founder of this particular school of religion. The effect of this narrative spirituality is to make this life, the life right now, here on earth, essentially a testing ground, a trial. The here and now is not the real reality. It's just a thin test run to see if you can follow all the God-given rules, laws, and commandments. You are primarily to put off any real satisfaction for now. Postpone all of that and get your real reward and real life in the world to come. If you follow all the commandments, obey all the God-given rules and covenants, if you live a basically sin-free life, then upon death, you are transported to heaven for all eternity, or at least a series of blissful reincarnations. This is your reward for the God-fearing, God-following life that you lived here on earth. In the monotheistic versions, you will live in this heaven forever, literally forever and forever. There's generally no coming back. There's no doing it over again. There's not another life on earth or anywhere else. Just everlasting, unending, ceaseless beatitude and unending radiance. This version of religion or spirituality is a type of belief system, a series of beliefs, often, as I said, of a mythic literal character, where mythic literal means, for example, Moses really did part the Red Sea, Lao Tzu really was 900 years old when he was born, Lot's wife really was turned into a sack of salt, and so on. These are mythic beliefs where magic elements are often thrown in. Water turned into wine, raising the dead, walking on water, flying through the air, walking through walls, and so on. And here we're not talking about real paranormal events or siddhi, which are rare, but for which there is substantial evidence that some do indeed exist. We're talking rather about what most would see as childish, magical wish fulfillment. Belief in magic and mythic elements are often part of the attraction of this type of religion. And without being judgmental about this, just stating the evidence, many people who are attracted to these magic, mythic belief systems are themselves at the earlier, more childish magic and mythic stages of human growth and development themselves, as several studies have indicated. But the whole point of this type of religion is that it is actually a type of multiple intelligence that all humans have, called spiritual intelligence. What recent research has shown is that humans indeed have upwards of a dozen multiple intelligences. Not just cognitive intelligence, long thought the one and only major intelligence human possessed and measured by the all-important IQ test, but also emotional intelligence, moral intelligence, kinesthetic intelligence, intrapersonal intelligence, aesthetic intelligence, and, yes, spiritual intelligence. Further research has tended to bear out the fact that as different as these multiple intelligences are, and by the way, they are also referred to as lines of development, but as different as these multiple lines all are, all of them nonetheless grow and develop to the same basic major levels of development. So, different lines, same levels. This overall process of development is referred to as growing up, because it follows the basic levels of development as they move from infantile to childish to adolescent to early adulthood to late adulthood to elderhood stages of growth. The specific stages or levels of growing up have been given many different names. Remember, these developmental levels cover all the different developmental lines, and therefore the number of different names that can be used is quite large. I'll be using a number of different names for these levels of growing up, and I'll start with a variation on them given by the pioneering developmental genius, John Gebser. But please remember, this is just one version of possible names for these major levels, including the levels of spiritual intelligence. So don't get caught up in them if you're not fond of them. Well, see, there are many others. But this particular version of the basic levels of development or growing up, which apply to all the various multiple lines, is the archaic level of a line, the magic level of a line, the mythic literal level, the rational level, the pluralistic, the integral, and the superintegral. Each of these names mean pretty much just what they sound like, although we will be giving some specific examples as we go along so you'll be able to see exactly what is meant. Now, to jump to one important conclusion very quickly, and then we'll explain it. But the problem with the magic and mythic literal levels of spiritual intelligence is that, as you can see in the list I just gave, those are some of the very lowest levels of spiritual intelligence available. And yet they are by far the most common levels worldwide. And that's a problem. As you can imagine, this discovery of the existence of spiritual intelligence as one of the multiple lines or intelligences that all humans have is a major breakthrough and has enormous implications for religion and spirituality altogether. Now, there are numerous schools of developmental psychology, most of them focusing on a particular intelligence or line or a group of them. So Kohlberg focused on moral intelligence, Piaget on cognitive intelligence, Graves on values intelligence, and so on. But what's so interesting is that virtually all of the developmental schools, no matter how much they differ on details and specifics, virtually all of them give essentially the same basic 6 to 8 or so major levels of development. Again, different lines, same basic levels. In a book I did called Integral Psychology, there are charts of over 100 different developmental systems. And what is so striking about those charts is that you can see in the vast majority of them something similar to these same 6 to 8 major levels continually showing up. Some models give a few more levels, some a few less, but essentially these same 6 to 8 stand out time and time again. The many different multiple intelligences or developmental lines and the essentially similar developmental levels they all grow and evolve through are some of the very most fundamental components of the human psyche. So if we return to the first type of spiritual engagement, the narrative belief system, what we find is that this type of religion relies primarily on spiritual intelligence in the path of growing up. But, and here's the rub that we just pointed out, the most common of these religions are not at a particularly high level in that line. Spiritual intelligence is defined as how we think about, picture, view, or conceive ultimate reality. Scholars like Paul Tillich and James Fowler call it how we view and relate to our, quote, ultimate concern. Now, we will soon contrast this type of religion, a belief system in growing up in the spiritual line of intelligence, with the second major type of spirituality, not that of growing up, but that of waking up. This involves not spiritual intelligence, but direct spiritual experience. And it results not in life everlasting in some heavenly hereafter or reincarnated heavens, but in a direct enlightenment or awakening or metamorphosis in this here and now. Although they are often found together and intertwined, these clearly are two profoundly different types and practices of spirituality. Spiritual growing up and spiritual waking up. And this, as we'll see, leads to a very large number of very important conclusions. So to return to the spiritual intelligence and spiritual growing up through the major 6 to 8 levels of development, this does mean that the narrative versions of virtually any or all major religions do not have to stop at the magic or mythic stage. In other words, as we just pointed out, in the spiritual intelligence line, which, like all lines, goes from archaic to magic to mythic to rational to pluralistic to integral and superintegral, so that there is an archaic approach to ultimate reality, a magic approach to ultimate reality, a mythic approach to ultimate reality, a rational approach to ultimate reality, a pluralistic approach, and so on. But many, even most, of today's major religions are stuck at the magic and mythic levels of their own spiritual intelligence. Now, that's an important realization. But just as important is that they don't have to be stuck there. There are, in fact, several higher levels of spiritual intelligence available to them. And there are indeed individuals in every major religion that are at these higher levels. And in fact, there have been empirical studies, including ones like the extremely significant studies of stages of Christian belief by James Fowler, clearly showing that there are individuals who can be found at every level of spiritual intelligence. In other words, even though most of the dogmatic and fundamentalist forms of Christianity, for example, have major components at the magic and mythic stages, there are individuals who still profess a strong belief in Christianity, who are themselves not only at magic and mythic stages in their spiritual intelligence, but also those at the rational, pluralistic, integral, and super-integral stages. Other studies show unmistakably similar conclusions for religions including Buddhism, Islam, and Hinduism, among others. In other words, even though the accepted dogmas of many of these spiritual systems are officially at a magic mythic stage, many individuals continue their spiritual growth into the higher stages of spiritual intelligence, moving on from mythic to rational to pluralistic to integral. And we're not yet discussing the role and importance of that other spiritual engagement called waking up. We will, of course, get to that. The point is that versions already exist of all of these higher stages of spiritual intelligence in all the world's religions. Now, today, although this is rarely realized, simply because developmental levels themselves are rarely acknowledged and poorly understood. And so these enormously important notions are almost totally ignored, and with often truly unfortunate results. The evidence for these developmental levels is substantial, in some cases overwhelming. For example, these major levels in the cognitive and moral lines, these 6 to 8 major levels, have been tested in over 40 different cultures worldwide, including Amazonian rainforest tribes, Australian Aborigines, Mexican workers, and individuals in India. No major exceptions have yet been found to these stages. Now, most people, certainly in the West, think of religion as being this narrative belief structure type of religion. This growing up in spiritual intelligence, whether they use those actual words or not, and further, they see it almost entirely in only its magic and mythic levels or stages, because that's where Orthodox religion, in many cases, has remained for the longest stretch of its history. So I'll use Christianity as an example of these stages. Again, there are published examples of these same basic stages in Buddhism, Hinduism, Islam, and so on. Although, of